Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, social historian, writer and broadcaster Ken Worpole speaks about his life and work, particularly the new edition of Modern Hospice Design, The Architecture of Palliative and Social Care, published by Routledge this year.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Ken Worpole, writer, broadcaster?
Yes, sort of, yeah.
About your new book, or your reissued book, Modern Hospice Design, The Architecture of Palliative and Social Care, which has come out again with Routledge. But before we get into that, Ken, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Sure, yes. Well, I was born in 1944. My parents were both living in the East End, but because the war was on, I was actually born in a castle in Derbyshire, to which the Salvation Army Hospital in Hackney was removed for the duration of the war. And then I was in Leytonstone until the age of 6, and then we moved out to coastal Essex, to Hadley, and then eventually to Southend. And strangely, that relationship between East London and coastal Essex has, in the last couple of decades, become to slightly obsess me. I've been completely fascinated by the push-pull relationship of the East End of London with suburban and rural Essex, especially around issues of culture and this kind of tension around what is country, what is city, and what is in between. And also notably between the fact that Essex became the territory where a lot of social experimentation happened as a result of the extreme poverty of the East End of London, and organisations like Salvation Army or people like George Lansbury were endlessly trying out back to the land experiments or creating settlements for rehabilitation of people with alcohol or health problems. And I guess for the last 20 years, I've been especially interested in notions of therapeutic settlements, alternative communities, religious and political, elective kind of communities. And that does actually go back to my childhood.
So were you trained in architecture? Because you write a lot, and you write a fascinating blog, and you write books, but there's always this spatial architectural kind of content to it. Were you trained as an architect?
I've been thinking about that since you made this invitation to talk about my early interest in architecture. The fact is, my father was a carpenter, and we were always moving because he was always renting kind of houses that had garages where he would immediately install a big circular saw and a bandsaw and various other things until the neighbours got petitions up to have us moved on. So there was always a workshop, and I kind of, by the age of 14, I was probably using a circular saw and a bandsaw, and I knew all the woodworking tools, and occasionally I helped him out on one or two jobs. So, you know, the practical skills around construction or all that kind of did come sort of naturally to me. But I passed 11 plus, went to the Southend High School for Boys. I didn't really enjoy it. And when I left school at 16, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. But there was a family friend who I rather admired. He was about 10 years older than me, and I was 16. But he'd become a civil engineer. He had a very nice lifestyle. He was interested in jazz, and I kind of slightly hero worshipped him. And he said, well, he could get me into civil engineering. He was working for a medium-sized piling firm, actually, in East Anglia, mostly doing roads and, sewage works and water. A lot of the territory was underdeveloped, and they were putting in the new road systems and so on. So I went to work for this company and enrolled at the Southend Municipal College Ordinary National Certificate in Building Studies. And from there I went to work for a much larger firm, Braithwaite's, a piling company, with whom I worked for about 3 years on big projects. We worked initially at Camel Lairs in Liverpool on the new construction of a new dock, then to Glasgow on the now notorious Red Road flats, where I was kind of measuring out the site, putting in the positions of the piles and so on. It was hard work, and I really, after about 3 years, I realised I was completely temperamentally unsuited to being away from home. Piling, of course, if you're involved in piling, you're the first on the site. You turn what is usually a greenfield site into a quagmire, and the winter in Glasgow was terrible. So, and all you can do in the evening is just simply go to the pub because you're in lodgings or digs. And 3 years of that turned me off to that. So I then applied to become an English teacher as a mature student. So I went to Brighton and did my training there, and then became an English teacher for a number of years in Hackney.
Which school in Hackney?
Hackney Downs. Yeah, it was a boys' school, a very interesting school. Actually, someone's just sent me the manuscript of a history of Hackney Downs School. It was known for a while as the Jewish Eton. I arrived the year it became comprehensive, but it was always a boys' school, and by the 1940s, it was possibly a third to 40% Jewish, mostly secular Jewish students. Very, run as very much as a kind of public school, gowns and everything like that. But I did enjoy it, and I suppose. But then I became much more interested in the history of the surrounding area, Hackney. I was becoming very interested in Hackney, and I fell under the influence of people like Raphael Samuel, the oral historian, and and then I met Colin Ward actually in 1973 in my last year of teaching, who became both a close friend but enormous influence on me. And I then left teaching to set up an oral history project in Hackney. So that was the next stage in my kind of slightly change of career as a social historian. I always say when I do call myself a social historian now, but when other people call me a social historian, I always say now that when that happens, somewhere an angel dies or a fairy dies, because I have no historical qualifications whatsoever. But that's the way of the world.
Yeah. A historian is someone who writes history, I suppose. And this idea of oral history, I'm really fascinated by, because obviously, from the academic perspective, we have this rather strange system in place of historiography, as it's broadly called, which is very controlled, very contrived. The oral history thing that you're describing is something very different. But I wanted to come back to something you'd mentioned before we started recording, and maybe this seems rather cliched to you, but this idea of you living now in the East End of London as in a mansion flat with a shared garden. Do you feel like this has been part of the inspiration behind the work that you've done? Because the work, as you've described it, looking at the idea of intentional community, it's quite a radical kind of departure. So it's not a history that's well written about. And it's partly why I got in contact with you. Through a friend of mine called Hannah Loftus.
Yes, good.
You know Hannah?
I do, yes.
Yeah, well, she had tweeted about how she'd gone to Seaspeak, and so I'd looked you up, and then I'd been to see a intentional community that I used to go and stay with in the Midlands as a child, in a place called Laxton, which was derived from one of the intentional communities that you've written about down on the Essex coastline, where George
Othona. Yeah. Was it Othona or Freighting or the Adelphi Centre?
I think it was the Adelphi Centre.
Yeah.
And some of the families there had gone north and found a space and set up another community, and the community still persists in a certain way. Anyway, so I got in contact with you to talk about that intentional community thing, and to try and talk about a little bit about that. But I was wondering, do you feel like that your experience of living as a Londoner in that kind of space is significantly influential on the way that you imagine good society, good civic space to emerge?
Very much so. But the other big influence on me is the fact that we are 100 yards from Clissold Park, which is one of the great parks of London. And we've lived close by the park for over 50 years, and I've probably been in it at least every other day, if not every day. And no day has ever been the same. And I very early on, I was fascinated by what you might call park space, or the kind of the theatre of park life. And it's a self-managed theatre. People choreograph their own behaviour in it. It's amazing. You can get on a busy Sunday 12,000 people in the park, but no police officers. If you put 12,000 people in the other part of London in a 50-acre site, there will be security guards everywhere. And I've been fascinated by the self-discipline of park use, and also the myriad things that people do in parks, and also it's unusually the porousness of the difference between private and public. And that does take me back to how I began to get very involved in public policy. In 1996, I was involved with setting up Demos, the think tank. We knew there was a Labour government coming, and we were looking for a big project to kind of think about job creation and so on. And it was the same year, in 1996, the Heritage Lottery Fund was set up. And one of their early projects got them some egg on their face, because they gave a grant to the Churchill Foundation, I think, for the Churchill Papers, or a foundation. And then it was transpired that, in fact, the nation already owned these papers, so it didn't look so good. And they were very keen to find a much more public-facing project. And they set up the National Parks Fund, or the Lottery Fund, Heritage Lottery Fund. And I did a lot of work for Demos in researching park use. And one of the things that I always remember, but there were many, many things that came out of that research, was that if you talk to young people about why they came to the park, they would say because it was private, and that the home they found was too public, that their parents or their brothers and sisters were always annoying them. It was very difficult. And that they came simply to sit on a bench or read a book or listen, to music on earphones. And I became really interested in this notion about the mixture of public and private, how they can coexist within a small space. And also the kind of mutability of the weather and the seasons in parks make it such a kind of universal setting. Yeah.
It's a really interesting idea. But this book that you've had reissued, the second edition, Modern Hospice Design, as I said in my email to you, there seems to be, to me, a general interest in much of what you've written around care, environmental, spatial care, and the way that space can be articulated to make it more likely to occur. And I was reading Modern Hospice Design, and I was thinking, well, and you set out at the beginning, probably even for the beginning half of the book, a sort of framework to contextualize that notion, perhaps, to deliver a kind of overarching vision of why it's important, what it looks like, how it operates. Perhaps you could tell us about a little bit about the original origins of this book, and why you think it's been, I guess, successful. And how perhaps it links back into some of these interests you have in intentional communities and alternative practices, and if there is one at all.
Well, there is, because the other thing I'm interested in, of course, is new building types, how rare it is for a new building type to emerge. And I, through personal experiences, I went to visit one or two people many years ago who had ended up in hospice, and I became intrigued by this kind of building type.
Hmm.
And I got to go and to St Christopher's on a day visit when they were showing people around, and I became very interested.
Hmm.
Now, St Christopher's is really regarded as the pioneer of what we call the modern hospice movement. I mean, the hospice has a very long tradition, but it was very
Perhaps,
often.
perhaps define what a hospice is, because I think perhaps that might be, certainly for international listeners, that might be something that's quite unique.
Yeah. Um, well, in the traditional hospice would have been a place where someone clearly so unwell that their death was very imminent would go for initially, obviously, religious reasons, where they would be their soul would be looked after, and they
Hmm.
would be given some spiritual comfort in their kind of dying days. Um, but in 1967, um, the founder of St Christopher's realised that spiritual relief was not enough. Pain relief was the key issue. And she set up St Christopher's with the idea that it was possibly that people would only be there for 10 days maximum. They would be sent there by the doctor. And there would be a very advanced program simply of pain relief, but interestingly, no medical intervention whatsoever. And this does make it very different from what was happening in geriatric wards in hospitals or in care homes. Um, she said, they wouldn't even take the temperature or blood pressure or anything. The whole project was simply to give dying people in their last days or hours, pain relief and therefore care and love.
Mm.
And that became a very successful model. I was lucky though, because when I became extremely interested in this at the beginning of this century, around 2005 or something like that, it was mutating in extremely interesting ways, from being a small inpatient unit, um, uh, very quiet, closed off from the outside world, a retreat, in fact, to opening up to offering complementary medicine, day care for people, various therapeutic regimes, and people coming and going to the hospice. Not simply, it was a revolving door. It was not simply that when you went in, you never came out again. And um, there was a very wonderful architect who tragically died too early, Ian Clark, who worked for JDDK Architects in Newcastle, who designed a number of hospices. He took me around several he'd designed. And he said, well, the difference now between now, and this was around 2006, and the early hospices, was that they have become living villages. And the sense of life there is now the important ethos of the building, that everybody gets a second chance or a last chance to have a very different kind of experience of peace, tranquility, which doesn't remind, again, going back to education, I've always been very interested in adult education or second chance education. I think we should all be offering people throughout their life another chance. And anything that any kind of institution or programs or funding or whatever that gives people a chance, no matter how late in life, to try something different or, be a different person, I think is very important. So that movement from the retreat, the quiet retreat, to the living village, which then, may have 1,500 people coming and going throughout the year. And if you go to St Christopher's now, if you go to many of the other hospices, there's all kinds of things going on. I've in the case study in the new edition of the book is St Wilfrid's Hospice in Eastbourne, opened about 10 years ago, actually, this month. And the main entry of that is actually a street. It's a large cafe. They have concerts in there. it's very much a part of the neighbourhood. I mean, it's a kind of social centre.
Mm.
And I think this demystifying of death and taking the fear out of death, but also having a kind of spiritual atmosphere interests me greatly. And I will end it on this little kind of iteration. I've been thinking about Larkin's poem about church going, where he talks about a serious building on serious earth. And I now think that the hospice, of which we've got now about 240 in the UK, has become the serious building in many communities where, because it's around death, but nevertheless it's opened itself out to being a place of immense kind of symbolic importance.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. And this issue around death, obviously, if that's been kind of front and center in a lot of, well, everybody's imagination over the last few years, sort of reared its head. But it was coming anyway, wasn't it? I'm very interested in this notion around architectures of death and care, because obviously, as organized religion, particularly Christianity, has stepped back, been pushed back from its eminent position in the public square. And churches, particularly, but religious buildings, places of worship, have always been places in which death is confronted.
Of course, yes.
It becomes more and more difficult for contemporary society to engage with that inevitability. And are you saying that hospices are taking on that role in a kind of secular society? They're starting to adopt that signification.
I am, and I think that they're doing it very well. Because you must remember that they're largely self-sufficient in funding. Through yes, I mean 75%, and this does raise an interesting question about architecture design and public funding, because if they were wholly part of the NHS, they would then have all their architectural guidelines would be massively kind of underwritten by decades of protocols, which would probably be so rigid that you'd kind of blow the life out of them as buildings.
Mm.
So this independence, as with mega centres, is very important to innovation and to creating a different kind of ethos, architectural ethos, and presence in the landscape.
Mm. What are the key spaces in a hospice? What are the critical spaces that, is it individual rooms? It's not ward-based accommodation. Are they residential units, much like a supported retirement community? And obviously they're not all for, if they're to do with palliative care or end of life care or new life care, perhaps is a nice way of putting it.
Yes, new life care. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's children involved, middle-aged people. There's people from across the age spectrum as well. But I mean, what is involved in a hospice?
Well, the ward system has more or less disappeared, although some people regret that, because some people would prefer to be in the company of two or three others. I mean, you would never have a ward of two, because if one person died, the kind of feeling in the room would be terrible. You've got to have three, but for health reasons, single wards. They're all now single story, and I think all modern hospices now have access to a garden space or a patio garden, so that in fine weather the bed can be wheeled out into the garden. And this is kind of quite I've been to a number of hospices where they're very proud of saying, and I think it's true, that a few of their residents, if they're lucky, manage to die in the garden, under the shade of an apple tree or something like that. But this ability to open up into the a land of water and trees and the wind and the elements in fine weather, it becomes very important. But then there also obviously is a large kind of cafeteria now where family and friends can meet, and the patients can sometimes be in there as well. A number of them now have gyms for the patients, and various forms of complementary therapy, water therapy, other kinds of healing treatments. So it's it's not low. It's no longer the quiet deathbed kind of scene that's being invoked. It's a place of where it's a kind of it's an anteroom in a way to the final world, and but it's an anteroom that's filled with good people doing good things and in very
Yeah.
calm surroundings.
The book itself doesn't just deal with, well, when I was sent a copy by Routledge, I assumed it would be specifically for buildings that called themselves hospices, but it's not. You look at hospices, but you also look at, as you've mentioned already, a Maggie Centre. I hadn't realised that Maggie Centres would necessarily fall within that category, but also retirement villages. You've got the Extra Care Charitable Trust's retirement village in Clifton in Nottingham, and the Maggie Centre is by and what's the architect there for?
Amanda Levitt.
And just to say, also the St Wilfrid's Hospice, which you mentioned in Eastbourne, is by RH Partnership Architects. So they're all different types of. I guess people wouldn't necessarily think of these as hospices.
No, they're not. I mean, the book was wide and is much more expanded to call itself, palliative and social care.
Mm.
It's also got Appleby Blue Almshouse, which is very much making a lot of waves at the moment. It's a very, unusual, extremely imaginative iteration of the traditional almshouse, very radical and very wonderful, I must say,
That's
as
by
well.
Witherford Watson Mann, isn't it?
That's right, yes. The Maggie centres, of course, are non-residential. That's the main distinguishing feature. But they are all they have to be located within the grounds of a large hospital with a big oncology department. But again, they are people are learning many lessons from them, particularly around internal design. I mean, the Maggie centres, the one that I in Southampton, Amanda Levy. I mean, it's extremely cleverly internally designed so that there are no doors internally, and yet there's lots of private spaces. But it's the way that the configuration of walls and sight lines allows lots of kind of these wonderful little niches of privacy. Yet there are no doors in the building, and then of course the main feature of most mega centres, all mega centres really, is the big kitchen table, around which people can meet or congregate, talk, chat, come and go, and that's for me very interesting because they've used a lot of kind of group therapy history in that, so that the table is very unobtrusively but most definitely managed by a member of staff who is skilled in, managing groups, and really choreographing, making sure that nobody feels isolated or left out, or if anybody gets very upset or slightly aggressive, can handle that. So there's a lot of kind of psychotherapeutic theory going, histories and understandings going into that. So in a way, why I become interested in this really is because they are new forms of settlement or intentional communities. Even if for some people it's only lasts 10 days, or if it's Maggie centres, it's an occasional experience. They are still communities that have a different kind of ethos of care and reciprocity. Very important. You can't do this on a one-to-one individual, doctor-nurse or doctor-patient basis. These all really depend on creating a kind of communal atmosphere.
The way you talk about health is really interesting because I think, if the COVID times taught us anything, that was certainly institutional power was sort of sorely lacking in that situation. There seems to be a kind of idea of co-production, or what Edgar Kahn calls time dollars. This idea of the way public service is delivered through a co-productive process between institutional people in positions of authority with expert knowledge and lay knowledge, and the way that lay folk self-manage and self-design things. And it sounds to me like that these environments, part of what is good about them is that they enable that kind of lay knowledge. They're not domineering spaces. They're not spaces in which a series of kind of top-down processes are applied to people, which would not be a particularly nice way of going if you were to be in your last days. And I was thinking about the New Jerusalem and the New English landscape as well, and the way that you seem to be quite interested in the way that ordinary people, non-professional people, lay people, have the way that their knowledge systems and practices work. Does that have, I mean, is that something that you have consciously pursued, or does that have any bearing on the way that these, in your interpretation, the way that these care spaces are effective? There's two questions, I suppose. Are you interested? Am I right in discerning that as an interest in your own work? And then does it manifest itself? Is that what you're picking out?
I suppose so. I mean, again, then I would come back again to this early interest in these why Essex became the kind of homeland of alternative living for a while, well, for decades actually, whether they were religious or political, therapeutic or whatever. Lots of run by churches, retreats, and there are still some quite important religious and retreats in the place, which relates, of course, to why Essex. Well, partly, I've already said, the proximity to the East End of London, but also because it has this kind of slightly inaccessible coastline with lots of islands and rivers and estuaries and quite difficult to access places. Some obviously with no access other than at low tide, and that became a natural home for creating spaces where people could retreat. And again, it's the relationship between town and country. I mean, I'm very interested in this Davidson Prize that Charles Holland in his practice won last year, which is kind of new forms of rural co-production and living. And well, I hope we're just going to see more of those, because the ecological and environmental needs of, again, in agricultural settings are very important. And if they can be combined with kind of social purposes as well, that's all to the better.
Is it trying to sort of unpick some of the anxieties around being modern? I often come to this thought, or industrialization. I mean, these intentional communities, these visionary communities that you talked about on the Kent coast and popped up in the early 20th century and mid 20th century all over the place, and which you document, and not just sort of grassroots communities, but also the way that, for example, you sent me a lovely article that you had in the New Statesman about Thaxted, the Church of Thaxted, where you've got individual characters, in that case the vicars, kind of struggling, I suppose, or setting up spaces in which a certain resistance to the anonymity and anxieties around being modern were possible. I mean, is that something? I mean, because the interesting thing about the care home world, these care environments that you're talking about, the hospices, they seem to me to be, they sit alongside hospitals, but hospitals have this strange scientific alienating character to the way that they procure your health. It's not, no one goes into hospital gladly.
No.
And these hospices seem to also be trying to, and that I think partly is because these hospitals have become more and more alienating, in that way that modernity is an alienating experience. You're more and more reduced down to a kind of avatar, a kind of cipher that is there to be treated, that is there to have treatment applied to you. So it's very interesting that these hospices, what do you call them? You describe them as living villages, are actually emerging alongside these spaces as a counterpoint and a sort of pre-modern counterpoint.
Yes, I mean, suppose if we think about Thaxted, we think about the music being very much part of Gustav Holst and Imogen Holst. And we think about, well, basically, death has become medicalized. I mean, this was said early on by Philip Perez in his great book. And what the hospice has done is actually to demedicalize it, say there are more important things. And the thing is, the pressures on medicalization, I mean, particularly in America, are horrendous because the insurance companies have got so much investment in keeping people alive very expensively because people are paying for it.
Mm.
And there's now quite a lot of research in, well, some terrible graphic descriptions of what happens in hospitals when the priority to keep someone alive kind of overrides the need for them to have a meaningful, peaceful death. And there's quite a lot of research I read on CPR, compulsory pulmonary resuscitation. And there's a description of a nurse in just one example where someone who's quite very ill is wheeled into the CPR room. There are 9 staff in there. They're all running around, pressing down the chest, and alarm bells are ringing and everything's going. And after about 30 seconds or 40 seconds, it doesn't work and they're dead. And then they all leave the room, just leaving a dead person there. Like, that's just terrible. It's basically like, you wouldn't treat an animal like that. And what the hospice really challenged was that sense that death is just kind of the end of a medical system or the end of, some kind of animalistic kind of process.
Yeah, even like like almost as if it's evidence of the failure of medicine.
Well, exactly. You're exactly right. Yeah, I mean, and that is obviously the doctors are, commanded to, sustain life wherever possible. But comes a point where that sustenance of life actually goes against the meaning of life. So the medicalization is the problem in the hospital system, particularly when it comes to the very vulnerable, very frail, very elderly people who have many, many complicated health problems, and who probably would choose, if possible, to go quietly in meaningful surroundings, obviously preferably at home.
Yeah. What has inspired this shift, do you think? I mean, obviously the conditions to hand, people expressing that they're uncomfortable with this. I mean, and as you're talking, I was thinking about Ivan Illich's book, Medical Nemesis, this,
yeah,
where he talks about how medicine is actually pathological in many respects. And he's a controversial figure, but he's talking about the American healthcare system, which certainly does seem to be fairly pathological, as you describe. But what has inspired this move towards these improved care facilities? What's the undergirding ethic at play?
I think it is. Initially, it was in public outrage at the conditions of what we used to be called geriatric wards, which is a hangover actually from the old workhouse. That at the end of life, people really had very little kind of human value. They were just there to be kind of warehoused, basically. And so this was Dame Cicely Saunders in 1967 decided that she would do something about it, offer a new model. And people really responded to that. And I think there are hundreds of thousands of people now very actively engaged in supporting hospices. So that, as I say, there are about 240 of them in the UK. They all raise 75% of their funding, and they all rely on very large numbers of volunteers. But they become an extremely meaningful place because, even after someone has died, that family and friends will often come back and fundraise and come back, for annual memorial meetings and so on. So, as you were saying earlier, in a way, it has taken the place of the church as the place where death is actually respected and given its proper significance. I mean, one thing we also haven't talked about is that I partly got into this sphere after the Parks World by being commissioned to do some work on the loss of burial space in inner London. I mean, that you can't get buried in London, and if you live in any of the inner London boroughs, you can't be buried near where you live. So if you want to be buried, you have to go out into the suburbs somewhere, probably rather grim, kind of flat, former agricultural land, dug up in rather meaningless ways. And that kind of the loss of the presence of death, either as a place or in a processional, because normally, traditionally, the coffin or the hearse travels through the community from the house to the cemetery. Very strong East End tradition, of course, of enormously flamboyant funeral processions, where life stopped for a minute. The street stopped with the shops. The people came out of their shops. That kind of notion. Well, death has disappeared from that. And one of the things we were asked to do as a research, and that by the Gulbenkian Foundation, was really look at how memorialisation was surreptitiously creeping back into cities by things like commemoration benches, planting trees, commemorative trees in parks. And in fact, I interviewed the heads of two inner London park authorities, and they were telling me, I mean, the lengths of which people would kind of at night, under cover of darkness, bring the ashes of their mother or father to plant them circumspectly beneath a particular tree that their parents had loved. He said, we're always having to deal with this. Or people planting trees, wrong season, wrong tree, again, under cover of darkness in the park, invariably died. But this kind of the way in which people are, I mean, and of course flowers on railings where there have been street accidents and so on. The desire for people to reintroduce kind of memorialisation back into the fabric of the inner city is extremely interesting.
Yeah, it is. I've thought about this for a long time. The particularly the grassroots manifestations of the memorialization of death. I mean, it's an interesting subject as an educator in architecture. You kind of try and steer students away from it, and it's for two simple reasons. One, it's too easy to make. If you say something's about death, it's very difficult to critique it educationally.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that it tends towards gloominess, and we try and keep our young people away from thinking about gloomy things, because God, if they start doing it, what hope have we got? And so as a consequence, that whole kind of discourse around memorialization has kind of disappeared. I think Edwin Lutyens is probably the last significant architect of death in the country. Peter Eisenman has done some very interesting things, particularly around the Holocaust of the Jews, and obviously Danny Libeskind. And it's kind of an interesting one because actually, as a culture, architecturally, urbanistically, we've become fixated by memorialization. We have museums for everything. We even have museums to everyday life, which is surely you could just have taken over the last Woolies and just left that open, and then that would have done it. So I really do find that idea fascinating, and that these hospices then are a corollary of that, aren't they?
They are, and I think it's very. I think they have to be commended for creeping up on this kind of unnoticed that actually they are now these very, they're kind of powerful centres of kind of meaning in many towns and cities.
Yeah.
Because everybody so many people go through them. Or they experience them either as friends or relatives, and so on. And it comes back to this, I think, that notion of the serious building on a serious earth. And seriousness is actually, under capitalism, is sadly lacking, because we're all supposed to be busy getting and spending, and not dwelling and thinking and remembering.
Yeah. Just a last question about these care environments. Have you thought about whether there are characteristics to the type of design processes used to make good ones? That is to say, one would assume a very well-known architect that her design process would be quite a traditional design process insofar as you employ a well-known architect to deliver their vision. That's part of what you're paying for, I suppose. But my understanding would be that in the way that you've talked about them, that actually a good care environment, a good hospice environment, would derive from a much more user-centered, user-led design process. Have you seen that?
Only, yes, the Mackey centres are interesting because, of course, their foundation, kind of, or their origins, it's Charles Jenks and his then wife, Maggie Keswick Jenks, whose diagnosis of terminal cancer created this idea of Mackey centres. I mean, they were very serious about the thinking needed for these places, and they use this phrase which I've always loved. In fact, I unfortunately I keep repeating it. They wanted a building that rises to the occasion, and I think that's very interesting because what is the occasion? Well, the occasion, I think, is a wonderful word because it's not a building that rises to death. It's somehow a moment of enormous importance, but it doesn't have to be death. And so there's that. But with the Amanda Levitt, the cleverness of the interior design, which allows for both privacy and publicness in a very small space. Without doors. I mean, one of the things with the mega centres that again, another original preset, no notices. You don't, if you have to be told that a room is an office or a room, another door is a toilet or another door is a bathroom and another door is the recreation room, you failed. I mean, if you can't, you don't go into other people's houses expecting to find notices on every door. If you work it out quickly, bedroom, so on. So there was a lot of thinking going into that, kind of how do you provide this environment without heavy messaging and big serious design kind of over-determination of what people should expect.
They must be extraordinarily good commissions to get insofar as you are dealing with this occasion or even more occasions, a constant unfolding of these emotional, physical occasions for people. And you've got very tight boundaries to what you can do as well.
The other thing about, I think one should also pay respect to the garden designer of Maggie's Southampton, Sarah Price, because, and it's a wonderful story, that when there was a lot of people at the hospital in Southampton were very keen to have a Maggie centre. But I think apparently the Board of Trustees were not happy because it would mean giving up some car parking spaces. And Amanda Levitt said, well, look, if you let me reconfigure the car parking spaces, I'll find room for the building, but still give you the same number of spaces, which she did. And then she commissioned Sarah Price, or the Maggie's organisation, commissioned the landscape designer Sarah Price to start work on the site, which was to create a very large, 4-foot high kind of earth wall around the site and plant semi-mature trees in it. so that once you're inside the building, you look out. I mean, it literally is in a corner of a large, horrible car park. But once you're inside the building, you're looking out into woodland. I mean, it's amazing. It's astonishing, kind of coup de theatre, you know.
Yeah.
It is like a kind of, in a way, like a theatre set. So,
Well, I mean, we get back to Clissold Park in the end, don't we?
yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that's, I think, a good point to finish on. Thank you very, very much, Ken.
Thanks very much, Ambrose.
That was good, was it not? Thanks to Ken for speaking with me, and Routledge for the book. A link to it is in the podcast description, and there are links to Ken's personal website and his online journal, The New English Landscape, which he produces with Jason Orton, the landscape photographer, which is worth a look. He published New Jerusalem, the Good City and the Good Society with the Swedenborg Society in 2017, which you might seek out as well. Thanks for listening.